We'll start off by talking about what economic conditions were like in the United States during the 1980s and the effect that that had on social programs that affected minority groups. Due to the work of civil rights organizations during the protest era of the 60s and 70s, you would eventually see the creation of a number of affirmative action programs throughout the United States. Affirmative action being programs that sought to fight against inequality in terms of hiring and in terms of admission into schools, right? So universities as well as employers had to hire or enroll a certain number of minorities and women because of affirmative action programs. But with economic downturn taking place in the late 70s and in the 80s in the United States, you would see attacks come on affirmative action programs. Okay, so what's going on in the early 80s? In terms of the economic downturn? Well, you see a rise in inflation, right? Which means that your money is not worth as much as it once was because there's too much money in circulation at that time. And so the value of a dollar actually goes down. So that means that the money that you're making at your job doesn't have the same value that it once had because products that you buy now cost more. All right, so you have to pay more in order to get a product, and so that means you have an increase in prices, and if you aren't getting an increase in your pay, that means you're making less money, right? Even though you're still making the same amount of money you were making a few years earlier, right? So that's the effects of inflation, and so you'll see the increase of inflation. You'll also see an increase in unemployment rates during this time. Part of this has to do with an increase in oil prices, which affects the economy in a number of different ways. The reason why oil prices are going up partly is because of a revolution that took place in Iran. And so you'll see the price of oil going up, all right, and that's going to affect the American economy as well at this time. You'll also eventually see a transition in the U.S. economy away from manufacturing jobs to service jobs. Okay, so whereas individuals may have once worked in a manufacturing plant or a factory, making a decent wage and having benefits, eventually those jobs would leave the United States, and you'll see jobs that are more focused on the service industries, right? So instead of working in a factory, you're working at some electronics store or a grocery store or McDonald's or something like that. In the service sector, you're performing services for the public. Now, due to this economic downturn, you're going to start to see more and more criticism against social programs that aim to help minority groups and other poor individuals in the U.S. One of these criticisms was aimed at the welfare state, the idea that the United States is becoming a welfare state that was taking care of individuals and basically not giving them an incentive to work. Taxpayers were upset that they're paying for these social programs that are allowing poor minority people to stay home and not work, and they're just living off of welfare. Okay, so that was some criticism being directed towards social programs that were meant to help the poor. Okay, but you have some taxpayers being upset about this, especially during this time of economic downturn. Other criticisms were aimed directly at affirmative action programs. They didn't like the idea that companies and universities were hiring and enrolling more minority groups over white individuals. Okay, they felt that this was reverse racism. Okay, so racism being directed at white people. Okay, because they weren't given an opportunity to enroll in certain colleges, or they weren't being hired at certain jobs. They feared that minority people were being hired over them, and that these minority people were not as qualified as they were. So some Anglo individuals felt that they were being discriminated against simply because they were white. All right, and so that's reverse racism. An example of this is the Bakke case. Bakke was an individual who was applying to get into UC Davis, and he was not accepted. Right, and he felt that it was because of affirmative action, right? That minorities were being chosen over him, and he wasn't accepted because he was white, and so he sued the university, and the case ultimately ruled in his favor. right? He was admitted into UC Davis, not because of affirmative action necessarily, but because the university had a specific number of minority individuals that it needed to enroll each year, right? So because of its enrollment practices and having a quota, that's why the court case ruled in favor of Bakke. Okay, but it didn't really have an effect on affirmative action in the first place, but it's just an example of how certain Anglo individuals were fighting against affirmative action, taking it to the courts because they felt that it was unfair, that it was reverse racism. All right. The president at the time in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan, he was against affirmative action as well. And he was responsible for nominating judges who were also against affirmative action, right? Conservative judges to both the Supreme Court as well as to federal courts. Okay, and so once you have conservative judges in the court system, if the issue of affirmative action happens to go to the Supreme Court, they can rule on it, and there's more a likelihood that they're going to rule against affirmative action, right? And that could jeopardize that social program across the United States, right? And so by Reagan putting these conservative judges in these powerful positions, that threatened affirmative action. Other criticisms were aimed at the ethnic studies programs in colleges, programs like Mexican American Studies or African American Studies or Native American Studies, right? You have criticism coming from within the schools about these programs, right? Saying that they're not necessary and, they're just kind of propaganda that are turning people against the Anglo population and against the United States because of, they're telling the history of what actually happened. They don't say that, but that's pretty much what's going on, right? So like people are learning about this history and yeah, it could give you a negative perception of the United States and of society, right? And so there's all this criticism coming against ethnic studies programs as well as ethnic teachers, who are being hired because of the civil rights movement and the protest era of the 60s and 70s. You see more teachers of different ethnicities getting hired. And so there's criticism towards that, saying that, oh, these people are not qualified. They just got hired because they're a minority. Right, and so you're seeing more and more criticism coming against these social programs that were a result of the protest era, right? Of all that work by civil rights organizations, now the fruit of their labor is coming under attack during this time of economic downturn. Later on in the 90s, you're going to see a proposition in California, Proposition 209, be passed in 1996, and Proposition 209 pretty much would make affirmative action illegal. Right? So no more affirmative action in hiring practices or in enrollment in colleges or giving contracts to minorities. All of that would end because of Proposition 209. So, I used to wonder, like, why am I not benefiting from affirmative action? What's going on? Well, it's Proposition 209, okay, 1996. And so this had an effect on the enrollments in schools. Basically, you would see less and less minorities being enrolled and accepted into universities, right? The number of African Americans and Mexican Americans would go down dramatically after the passing of Proposition 209.